Hi, I'm John Paul and a really warm welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about relationship red flags. I'm going to do this in three parts. I'm going to talk firstly with some suggestions about what are red flags, what might red flags be in relationships. I mean, you'll have your own ideas about that, so I'd love to hear your ideas as well, of course, as ever. But I'm going to talk about what those red flags might be, and then in the second video talk about why we might, at least initially, not even see them in somebody else, and then also added to that, when we do recognise them, why we might endure, deny them and stay, irrespective of whether those red flags are there or not. And then lastly, in a third video, I'm going to talk about how we will avoid or could avoid doing that. How we might be able to spot them initially more easily, and also avoid staying in situations where things are traumatizing or really problematic, but we're finding it hard to get out. So I'm going to cover all those things over the course of three videos. As I say, today it's going to be about some suggestions as to what those red flags are. Just looking at the term red flags, what I would say it means is it's warning signs of problems within the relationship, perhaps in the other person. You might say problematic behaviour, but as you'll see when I'm going through some of these, it's not always behaviour that people engage in, it's actually things they may not be doing as well, for example. So it's sort of warning signs. Therefore, we aren't necessarily talking about getting out immediately of the relationship. They're things that I think is important not to ignore, because over a long period of time, or even in the short term, they're things that will cause you distress and may also, over time, mean that the relationship struggles as well. So, as I say, I'm going to come up with some ideas about them. You'll see that general principles wise, they're things that will affect whether somebody holds boundaries or not, or honours boundaries. There'll be things, around empathy, things around how directly somebody communicates or not, because most relationships stand or fall on the basis of communication. And this really important thing that is, does the other person have the capacity to see that you're 50% of the relationship and they're 50% of the relationship, and what does that look and feel like? So you'll see that quite a lot of these are around those kind of themes, empathy, that kind of thing. Because fundamentally, what we're looking to do in all relationships, I'm going to talk a lot about romantic relationships here, but when I say about red flags in relationships, a lot of these things are going to be issues potentially in, say, sibling relationships, parent-child relationships, even friendships. I mean, red flags comes up a lot in the context of romantic relationships, but as you'll see, this is about all relationships, really. Boundaries, communication, my reality being 50% and yours 50%, those kind of things, empathy, they're fundamental qualities that are necessary for all relationships. And I think what most of us would want from all relationships, we might say, is to love and be loved. And I think the difficulty with these red flags is they suggest that there are obstacles to that. Either it makes somebody more difficult to love, or it makes them more difficult to be loving. So there's sort of obstacles, barriers in the way of that experience of loving and being loved that most of us want from relationships. Of course, it's not going to be all the time that we're in that place of loving and being loved. Human beings ebb and flow, connect and disconnect all the time, and I will be talking about that throughout. But largely, I guess we would want our relationships to be characterized by loving and being loved. And I think if these red flags are around, we either ignore them, or we don't see them, or we then go on to ignore them. What happens is that relationships get characterized by something very different. They can get characterized by fear and disconnection and complaint and criticism, all kinds of things. And I think, throughout this, I'm going to explain why I might think that is. And when I say love and be loved, I do think it's important here to draw a distinction between loving somebody, so that underlying love, the attachment, the bond that we would have for someone, and then how loving they are on top. And I think it's really that how is loving is somebody on top of that that's the key thing here. I mean, you might say even with parents or romantic partners that they would be devastated if you weren't around, and vice versa. So that would be the love underneath, the kind of attachment underneath. But bracketing that for the purposes of these videos, what I think is really key and what I'll be focusing on here is how loving somebody is on top of that. And in order to be loving, qualities tend to be things like empathy, patience, forgiveness. But I'm going to come on to those. those. And in terms of that love on top, we learn that either through being well loved in early experience in our environment growing up, having a well loved being by others, by our caregivers, or some people don't have that experience at all, but they sort of earn that over time through hard work, through whatever that might be. It could be therapy, could be all kinds of personal development type things, perhaps spiritual practices. But I think we really need to see here love, that sort of love on top, as an emotional skill. And there's a lot of people either were not in well-loved environments, unfortunately, in terms of loving behaviour, and that's led them to have these kind of relationship red flags, these warning signs. So just starting as to what they are after that introduction, I'm not going to cover here things that legally, culturally, we've made criminal offences, because clearly they're red lines. Things like physical violence, coercive control, stalking, harassment, sexual violence, financial scamming, that kind of thing. As I say, I'm not going to cover them here because anything that's been made criminal, illegal by the wider society, of course, I think needs to be a red line. That doesn't mean, though, in terms of relationships, perhaps romantic relationships, even within families, that sometimes those things are denied or ignored or excused. The thing that I would say about that is the fact that something like that, a criminal offence, occurs within a sort of what purports to be a loving relationship, doesn't make it better or more excusable. It makes it more egregious, I would say. So from that point of view, I would just say that I think the default way of looking at anything which is sort of externally criminal is to imagine how you would feel, what would you think, feel, do if somebody did that who was a stranger to you. And I would go from there. But as I say, I'm not going to cover that in detail here. Most of these things that I'm going to talk about as red flags will be things that are perhaps more difficult to notice, perhaps more subtle in some ways. Okay, so just starting with the first one, and that's a sort of dominance of anger. And when I say anger, it's anything on the anger scale: irritation, annoyance, frustration, impatience. Patience is waiting without anger, intolerance, those kind of things. The reason I would put that here, and by the way, these aren't in any particular order, they're all in some ways going to be problematic or warning signs over time. But as far as anger, the difficulty with that, of course, is that when we're in that place of anger, our perception of the other person is going to be distorted. We lack empathy for the person. We have to win. We have to get them to bend the knee. And look, anger, and I'm going to just mention it in a minute as well, fear, they're part of the protective part of us. They're incredibly important from the point of view of our survival, both physically but emotionally, and also that of our dependence as well. So it's not as if, of course, we're going to ever live a life without them, and it's vital to have them in life. I think the difficulty can be, and I will talk about fear in a minute, but with anger is where it dominates, and it can dominate for some people. It is always disconnecting. And when we're in that place of anger, of course, as I say, we're going to want other people to bend the knee. We need to win. We will not listen to somebody else's point of view. The important thing here, from the point of view of relationships, is that we see ourselves as a victim. Although some people attack when they're angry, actually what they're often doing is trying to defend themselves. They perceive that they're threatened. So the anger mindset, and I'm going to come on to fear as well, which is the same, is a victim-perpetrator mindset, is that I'm somehow being done to. And of course, sometimes people are being done to. But anger in imagination, fear in imagination means that sometimes or often, if those dominate, if we're not sufficiently managing them and in control of them, if we're reacting from them rather than just responding from them, we will be consistently in a sort of victim-perpetrator mindset. And the trouble with that, of course, in relationship is if you get into a discussion or argument or confrontation with somebody in that situation, you will always be seen as a perpetrator. And I think, that becomes very difficult over time to sustain relationships because it can become very disorientating and confusing. You might raise a criticism, or you might raise just a challenge or be curious about something in the other person. If it's always met with that it's an attack, some sort of personal attack, that you're victimizing them, that you're criticizing them, that's going to be really problematic from the point of view of sustaining a connected relationship over time, because of course what's happening there is your reality, your needs, your wants somehow shrouded in an attack, rather than just you being a separate person who's raising some difficulty within the relationship. All relationships have rupture, repair. If somebody is dominated by this sort of chronic anger, irritation part of themselves, the difficulty is, of course, they will rupture more often, or the relationship will rupture more often, and repair is going to be much more difficult. They always see themselves as a victim in any situation. They're not going to take responsibility for their part in it, and I don't mean blame, I mean responsibility, just to take accountability, and they're going to struggle to see your part because, as I say, when somebody's angry, they do not empathise with the other person because the other person is perceived as somebody attacking them. So they have no empathy for the other person. And I think in order to not rupture and also to repair, that taking responsibility and accountability for our part, and certainly a capacity to empathise with the other person, not necessarily agree with them, but certainly to empathise and to attune to them, are essential parts of that. So if somebody's dominated by this kind of survival part, by this chronic irritation, annoyance, frustration, intolerance, anger, it's going to make the relationship very difficult. You will find yourself probably walking on eggshells around them. You will find yourself having to just bend the knee in arguments, just to stop and give up and hide away whatever your needs and wants are. And that, of course, leads to problems. It leads to sweeping things under the carpet, which leads to problems on an ongoing basis in the relationship. Also, if somebody is externalizing their anger a lot and getting into arguments with other people, or even engaging in kind of legal disputes wherever they go, and fighting, that will be visited on you too, because the person you're in a relationship with will be distressed a lot of the time. They'll be talking about it, constellating around it. It's very dominant for people psychologically if they're angry about something. So again, that will be visited on you in that way. As I've already said, it's a part of life, this survival part. We need it, but I think it has to be under management. It has to be under our control. And if somebody's consistently angry, they will need to dominate. They need to win. They need to control, which is potentially a problem. I was talking about communication and boundaries earlier. Of course, when people are angry, they communicate in a way which can be attacking. Most often, when somebody is angry or annoyed, underneath it is that they think something's unfair, or they think they are under attack or under threat themselves. But many people have sort of that conscious of the difference between defending themselves and attacking someone verbally. And I think people get into that kind of problem too if anger is very dominant. So communication becomes a problem. And of course, if you're angry all the time, you don't tend to honour other people's boundaries either. It's the either behaviourally, verbally, is stepping over somebody else's boundaries. Yeah, so I think if that's around, it's very much a potential red flag. Somebody's struggling to self-soothe, possibly. They're struggling to know when they should employ that protective part. They're just indiscriminately employing it. You might, when you go initially into a relationship with somebody, see it going outside. It might not be targeted at you in a romantic relationship at first. And I'll talk about the process of relationship and the stages they go through. There's very good reason why it may not be targeted at you, at least initially. But do notice this if it is going externally, because at some point it probably will start to get targeted at you in the relationship as well. Just as an extension of that kind of survival part in this, if that's dominating somebody who's fearful a lot. Again, it may not be as difficult in relationship as perhaps acted out anger externally, but fear is similarly disconnecting. Fear in imagination imagines monsters, personalizes things that aren't personal, it catastrophizes, and of course that might be going out in the world, at least initially, but at some point that lens will be turned towards you as well, potentially. So very fearful people often get very jealous, get very insecure, therefore try to control those types of things. So I think dominant fear, where that's around a lot, anxiety, nervousness, where it's dominant, that's what we're talking about here, and not imbalance, where we're not getting the best of it, we're at the mercy of it. Same with anger, we're at the mercy of it rather than taking the benefits of it. But fear as well, very disconnecting. Again, it's a victim perpetrator type dynamic. If I'm feeling threatened, feeling fearful, I perceive myself as the victim in a situation, which makes me quick to rupture probably, and makes it very difficult to repair unless I can shift out of that mindset and see the other person's point of view and see their part, if we're looking at repairing something in a romantic relationship. Look, you might say when looking at all of these as well that there's a lot of people that get annoyed a lot. There's a lots to be annoyed about in the world. Similarly with fear, lots of people are anxious and have anxiety. But I think what I'm saying about these, these are warning signs, aren't they? They are potential problems. They are things that can be addressed and probably need to be addressed if we're going to have this relationship where we are with somebody who's easy to love and who's loving towards us, and vice versa. The next one, just drawing on this point about taking responsibility a bit more, as I've said, the sort of very dominant fear, dominant anger mindset are going to be problematic. It's unlikely that somebody's going to be able to take responsibility there. It's always going to be blame of another. Somebody else is always going to be perpetrator when we're in that part. So we need to be able to be managing it. So really notice if somebody is able to do that. Are they able to self-soothe? Can they in relationship regulate that part of them? Is it under management? So I think it's a warning sign if somebody doesn't seem to be able to accept that accountability and responsibility in a neutral way, because I think it's equally a warning sign if somebody is firstly that attacks others or sees you as the perpetrator in every situation and can't get away from that, but then turns their anger on themselves. Those are two sides of the same coin, and that is what some people do. You will either be blamed, or afterwards they will feel terrible themselves and think they're a terrible person. The latter might sound like taking responsibility. It might sound like they're looking at their part in it, but I don't think that is necessarily the case. It's either anger turned outwards, it's your fault, or anger turned inwards. I'm the terrible person, it's all my fault. And I don't think either of those places are the ones of avoiding rupture or certainly bringing about repair in relationship. I think what we would like to see is that sort of neutral, balanced, expansive view of our part in something and also the other person's part, the capacity to empathise with the other person, but also the capacity to empathise with ourselves and to be able to hold both of those and to come to somewhere which is a sort of balanced view that takes into account, yes, that other person's 50% of this relationship and also that I'm 50% of this relationship as well, their emotional experience, and also honours my emotional experience too. And I think that's the ideal. So rather than turning on ourselves, I think what we probably want to see in terms of a green flag would be curiosity and self-reflection, those sorts of qualities. We all, as I say, ebb and flow. We're all connecting, disconnecting. We all have the capacity to react. We all have the capacity to be dominated by these parts that can cause problems in relationships. But as long as it's coupled with at least some point afterwards with some sort of curiosity and self-reflection, then I think that's going to be a green flag. Some people, because of this victim-perpetrator mindset, that they're unable to take any sort of responsibility in situations, will never and have never apologise, for example. And actually, in some ways more important than apologies, I think, often a lot is made of saying sorry. But some people also learn to say sorry just to get rid of something because they know it's going to be over if they say sorry. But the thing that I would be looking for in terms of a green flag in someone is their capacity, not necessarily just to say sorry, or even to say sorry at all, actually. It's the capacity to attune to your experience, to be able to genuinely, internally generate, I can see that was distressing for you and I can understand why. So some attempt, empathy and attunement, I always think that that's perhaps more important in some ways if you're looking at kind of rupture and repair type scenarios than somebody apologising afterwards. Like I've said, some people apologise just to get rid of it. They don't see their part in it. They don't want to take any kind of responsibility. They still see it as your fault, but they just want it over with because it's not that important to them and they want to get on with their day. So I think the sort of green flag to look for in these situations with somebody else is going to be, as I say, their capacity to attune, to empathise, to hold both your reality and their reality. Next one I would say is a disconnected relationship with their emotional experience. It's very key here. If somebody's disconnected from their emotions, what might that look like? Well, they wouldn't ever talk about them. They seem to, perhaps they go away and cry. You wouldn't ever see them cry in front of you. They, as I said, turn on themselves for their anger. They don't tend to like you being tearful. They don't like you being angry. They don't like you being fearful. So noticing what somebody's relationship with their feelings is, I use feelings and emotions, those words interchangeably. It's really important here. Of course, we are our thoughts, our feelings, our body, our behaviours, spirit, soul, whatever you believe. But emotions, not therefore the most dominant or important aspect of us, but they are a very important aspect. And a lot of us during early experience, and I'm going to come on to this in the second video, get disconnected from our emotional experience. And the trouble with that is we might therefore be going through life not taking the messages from our emotional experience, doing things we don't really enjoy, being around people we don't really enjoy, doing jobs we don't really like, and that is going to make somebody much more likely, for example, to be dominated by their fear, to be dominated by their anger. But equally, they are not empathizing with themselves. They don't honor their feelings. They don't take the signals from them. In fact, some people, as I say, have an aversion to their feelings. And the difficulty with that is not only, as I say, their own emotional state, which you will be living with, but also what they then therefore do with yours. If I don't empathise with my own experience, if I don't validate, if I can't tolerate what I feel and think, I am not going to be able to empathise with, validate, or tolerate what you think and feel. And if you're looking at sustaining ongoing relationships with somebody, I think that's a key quality, that someone has the capacity to do that. So I can really see why somebody said that, find people who look at you and you cry, and find people who cry in front of you. Not to make too big a thing of tears, but tears are about love, often heartbreak, grief, loss, and often people get disconnected from that part, but they're disconnected therefore from love, really. Heartbreak, grief, because grief is about love, heartbreak is about love. And I think it's going to be problematic to be in relationship with somebody who's disconnected from that part. Fundamentally, as I say, what we're looking for in relationship is to love and be loved. Tears can often be an indicator that somebody is occupying that part. If they don't want to cry in front of you or don't want to see your tears, there is some disconnection and aversion in some ways to that connection part. The next one I would say is noticing as a warning sign if somebody's very changeable and goes from one extreme to the other as well. I mean, all human beings change. We're all changing internally in response to things that are happening internally, thoughts, feelings, memories, imagination, and we're all changing in response to things that happen externally as well. But some people change much more than others, and it's a much more intense experience, and there's much more polarities. For some people, they're going from hero to zero. The world is going from the best thing in the world to the worst thing in the world, and others, and that could include you in a romantic relationship, for example, is either the best or the worst. And that kind of changeability suggests a few things. I suppose it suggests that internally, that part that's kind of managing that internal anchor that somebody might have, that's because it's often fear, it's anger, that changes somebody's internal experience. Suddenly they get frightened, suddenly they get annoyed. I'll talk about the competitive part in a minute too, but it tends to be those parts internally, which we all have, that really look like somebody's very changeable. If you're in your survival part, disgust, hatred, revulsion, anger are the emotions in there. How different they feel or sound to love, joy, excitement, contentment. But depending on, a memory or a sight, a sound, a smell, something, a word from somebody else, or an internal bit of internal dialogue can switch somebody between those parts. But again, I really think we need those parts to be under some sort of conscious management internally. And some people are not doing that. They're really kind of a flag in the wind, depending on what's happening either internally or externally. And obviously the difficulty that's going to happen with that is you're going to be riding that roller coaster with them potentially. Of course, when they're looking at you, sometimes they're going to be looking at you through a loving lens, and in that case you'll look like the best thing in the world, and that's the facial expression you'll see. And then at other times, if they switch to fear, or they become jealous, or they're annoyed by something that you've said, they could look at you with hatred and revulsion, and that is very disorientating, isn't it? We need a very strong sense of self in order to work out who we are in relationship with somebody who loves us, who is that changeable. And of course, it's not just going out. When that lens is turned inwards with somebody, they have a fluctuating sense of self, and they can go from the best in the world to the worst in the world. And of course, the emotions that go along with that, which again is going to be difficult to be in relationship with. When somebody doesn't have a particularly anchored internal sense of self, as I've said, they might go between superiority or worthlessness, or sit a lot with low self-esteem and this sense of worthlessness, which means for a lot of people, if there isn't this strong internal sense of self, they tend to be very externally validated. So in order to get their sense of self, their sense of worth and value, they're always comparing themselves to others. So to me, that would be another kind of red flag or another warning sign in somebody. If they're very externally validated, all of us are going to feel good when someone externally says you look great, or well done on that, or you're amazing, whatever. It's going to improve everybody's mood, isn't it? But some people are going from 0 to 60 when that happens, or in fact a minus up to 60. They're almost entirely externally validated. How might you notice that? They're very preoccupied with the things that other people see, with those things that are about comparisons externally with others. So their physical appearance, potentially their material status, wealth, the things that are easily compared to other people on a kind of quick level. The trouble with it, of course, is that they're always doing better than, less than with other people. That if somebody is better looking or richer, it might bring them down a bit in terms of their mood. And also they'll probably be very affected by external input. So if somebody says they're wonderful, as I say, they have an enormous high. But if somebody is critical of them, they get very triggered by that. And that is going to be difficult for you potentially, because it also means that anything that you say or do is going to have a very significant effect on them if they're not internally sort of discriminating about what's coming in. What we need is this internal sense of self, some sense of this is who I am, a solid sense of this is who I am, and be going into all kind of, have it in an empty room, but also any interactions we go into to be able to get hold of that, to keep hold of it. I think somebody needs to have that internal sense of self, and I'd say always fluctuates, all people are changing. It's going to be sort of question, curiosity, being informed by people in relationships as we go through life. But I think it's going to be a problem if somebody's sense of self is formed by others externally and is formed by those external things like their appearance or their material status or their wealth. It's very tenuous. It's not great foundations to be standing on, which is going to make somebody quicker to anger, probably quicker to feeling less safe in the world, and go back to that kind of dominance of those things, which can really cause problems in relationships. The next thing I can say, which is one to look out for in others as a warning sign, I would say, as one of these red flags, is where the love doesn't seem to run that deep, where somebody says all the right things and they're able to be very charming, say, but actually it doesn't seem to go much further below the neck. You know, they know what to say in order to charm. Actually, their main aim in life is, of course, to get people to love them, but actually, are they loving? Does that kind of love part, that connection part, go below the neck to kind of the heart? Is it fully embodied with someone? And I think those people can be very confusing to be in relationship with. When you first meet them, they're going to be very charming. Of course, there can be a real public and private split there. So they know that in public environments, they need to be very charming. They know how to get people to love them. But in private environments, you might see something very different. And all human beings are going to be different depending on the environment they're in. Different environments require different parts of us. To be able to adapt to that is an important social skill. But you might get somebody, if their sense of self again is very sort of fragile, they're all about pleasing other people externally, all about getting other people to love them. That's where they get their sense of validation. They're sort of very externally validated. You might say more narcissistic. People have this trait that it's all about getting others to love them. They know how to do that in terms of humour. They might put a bit of self-deprecation in there. They know how to flatter, how to compliment things. But if you're in a romantic relationship over time, you might see that it doesn't go much deeper than an ability to do that. And like I said, they might be very light publicly, but have a real shadow privately. And I think that's something really to look out for. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow with some people. And if there is this real split, not just a difference in how they behave externally, sort of outside the house, than they do within, but it's actually a total split, then that I do think is a warning sign. For a couple of reasons. It's suggesting this sort of external validation, which can make somebody's experience a real roller coaster. There's also something about being very nice to other people outside and then, say, coming home and talking about them and being horrible about everybody, that suggests somebody may not have grown up with the belief that they can say what they think and feel to everybody. And of course, again, we're editing what we say to people. That's a part of social interactions. But I think we would want somebody we're in a relationship with to know that whatever you can say will not ruin a real connection in relationships. And I think there's something about the public and the private split as well that can show that somebody doesn't believe that they're going to be liked or loved if they're fully who they are. And I think that can compromise intimacy. And if you're looking at what's sustaining long-term relationships, then I think intimacy will be one of those key qualities. So yes, that public and private split can really show that the love's not necessarily running as deep as it could, that other people are perhaps being used, that connection and love part is being used to get needs met rather than necessarily this genuine occupation of that love part of self more often than not. And one of the ways you can tell in which this is happening is disagree with the person. Is if somebody is narcissistic and is therefore often using that love part in order just to be loved and isn't actually that loving, that will be very clear if you disagree with them or don't meet their needs or don't do the thing that they want you to do. And I think, again, if you're looking at a warning sign, that kind of red flags in somebody else, look at what happens when you disagree with them. look at what happens if you don't meet their need. Next one to talk about here is lying. It might go without saying in some ways, but I think it's an important one to look at, that most relationships, or all relationships really, founded on, all good relationships are going to be founded on trust. The vast majority of people in any situation, if somebody's been having an affair or whatever it is, most people would say that I just wish you told me, I just wish you'd been honest. The vast majority of human beings can cope with whatever happens in relationships. They'll get through it, but they just need and want honesty. And in fact, one of the most difficult things that can happen, one of the most traumatizing things that can happen, is if somebody lies consistently and says that it's the other person's fault, or they're mad, or they're crazy. And people will do that. Unfortunately, narcissistic people often do that in relationship. They will lie about things that they've done or not done, and then blame the other person for responding to that. So I think it's really something to notice in another. We lie for all kinds of different reasons. Most human beings will have lied at some point or another, but there are different kinds of lying. I would say some people are lying to protect other people's feelings. So, they don't want to go out that evening, they don't feel like it, so they say that something else has come up rather than they just want to stay at home and watch Netflix. I don't think that lie is kind of manipulative or exploitative. It's really to protect self, but it's also potentially to protect the other person as well. But of course, scammers lie as well, and exploitative and manipulative people lie, and people get scammed by people that are meant to love them. People get scammed by siblings and parents. Children scam parents. People exploit each other, whether they're blood relatives or romantic partners, potentially. So I'd look out for lying, and how easy it is for somebody, how much of a pattern it is. Some people are lying to elevate themselves and make themselves look more special in front of other people. Again, it might be a sign that somebody's quite externally validated rather than necessarily has a very coherent, solid sense of self internally. Back to this point about communication, some people are going to be lying to other people or not telling the truth because they don't believe that nothing that you can say will ruin a real connection. But again, it can be a potential warning sign, because if you're looking at sustaining this ongoing relationship, repairing potential ruptures, somebody's communication and how they communicate is going to be key. So notice lying, I think, for all kinds of reasons. It is a potential warning sign if you think somebody's doing it to certainly exploit or manipulate other people, but also if it's suggestive of a lack of internal sense of self, so a lack of trust in self, or also a lack of trust in other people. Again, that's something that can be potentially problematic in the relationship too, I think. The next one, impulsivity. So impulsivity in another, I suppose spontaneity in another person would be quite an attractive quality often. We don't want to have to pre-plan everything in terms of romantic relationships. Somebody who's spontaneous, fun, those kind of things would be appealing qualities. As with all these, if we're looking at fear, if we're looking at anger, I'm going to come on in a minute to competition. They're a part of all human beings. They're very helpful if they're managed, if they're under management, and equally, impulsivity, as I said, can be an appealing quality. The difficulty is, of course, with impulsivity, what does it mean? Is somebody's doing something without sort of a forethought or thinking about the consequences? The difficulty with that in relationship, if that's dominant, it does suggest that potentially there isn't that part internally that's managing it, is not under management. And what can happen, therefore, is there's risk-taking behaviour which is engaged with. Impulsive people may not honour your boundaries. They might come over boundaries. They might come over their own boundaries. You would wonder what their internal sense of boundaries are like if they're consistently impulsive in a way which has adverse consequences for them. A struggle to sort of defer gratification, that kind of thing, can be signs of a tendency to addictions and dependencies as well. So I'd notice impulsivity in another, like I said, imbalance. It's about excitement and newness and fun. But if somebody is not sufficiently in control of that on an ongoing basis, there's a pattern, it can lead to problems in the relationship. And they may struggle, of course, to defer gratification outside of the relationship as well. So just something to keep an eye on, I think. The next one I would say is about somebody paying attention to you. And I think this is really an important one. It's often one that people don't notice. I'm going to talk in the second video about why people kind of ignore red flags, don't even notice them. And I think one of the reasons for that is going to be, as I'm going to talk about, but our early experience of things. The key here, I think, in terms of love in relationships, is that we pay attention to things that we love, and that includes people. This idea of love languages is around at the moment, and I remember seeing somebody on TV saying they speak every love language, and I don't see why that shouldn't be the case, actually, if we love someone. What some people might be doing is sort of selecting a love language, whether that's, say, physical affection or acts of service, and saying, well, that's what I do, that's how I show my love. And paying attention may not be one of those things that they do. By the way, I have done a video on love languages, so perhaps have a look at that. But, in this situation, I think we need to see that somebody's paying attention to us. And if they're not paying attention, then I think that's a potential problem, and indicating a potential problem about how deep their love goes, actually. And by paying attention, I don't mean that somebody's always looking in our direction. I'm just saying that we're not having to settle for crumbs. If you're looking at somebody whose primary preoccupation is, for example, with work, relationships become a sideshow, and that will include you in a romantic relationship as well. So I think I'd really be looking out for, are you the main event in their lives, and what does it look like for you not to be? So I think paying attention, your reality being as important as their reality, would look like somebody leaning into your interests. It's not that they have to be interested in the same things as you. Of course not. We're attracted to people who are similar but also who are different. Difference is interesting. It doesn't mean somebody has to feel the same way about everything that you enjoy. But I think to lean into it, not to invalidate it, not to ridicule it, not to ignore it, because your thoughts, your feelings, your opinions, the things that are really important to you, the values that are important to you, I think if we're looking at romantic relationships or any other relationship actually, somebody should to a degree be trying to lean into them, to try and acknowledge or find out why it is that you're interested in those things. That's around, opinions and interests, paying attention. The phone can get in the way a lot of that. But I'd be looking at making sure that somebody is at least bodily paying attention as well, that when you walk in a room, that somebody turns towards you and they genuinely are interested in what you're saying, and not just say, the intellectual part of you, your thoughts, but genuinely interested in your emotional experience of something as well. Ongoing relationships, it's never going to be possible to be doing that all the time. As I've said, there are all sorts of stresses and complicated things that are happening in people's lives. But for to know that somebody, the other person, prioritizes paying attention to you, and that your emotional experience is at least some, or quite a lot of the time, of importance to them too. I think those are green flags, and it's red flags if that's not the case. Some people have been talking about this kind of breadcrumbing in early on in relationship, where people are starting out in relationships as kind of a red flag. Breadcrumbing being that somebody is saying that they're interested and is saying the right things in relationship, but their behaviour suggests that they're not actually that committed and they don't really want to be there. And that is very disorientating for people. And it goes back to what I was saying above about those people, where I think the key thing in any relationship is for them to be loved rather than for them to be loving. So this idea of breadcrumbing is that somebody, as I said, they are showing or willing when they're saying things to you, but their behaviour, you only hear from them every few days or every week, and it's not in line with that. So back to this thing about paying attention. If somebody loves you, they will be interested. If somebody loves you, they will want to share things in their life that are going on with you, and they will want to know what's happening for you, I think. And from that point of view, there won't just be a superficiality of conversation. There'll be a genuine interest in depth. Again, like I've said, not all the time. That's not possible with everything that we have going on in our lives. But somebody's going to be curious about your world, I think, if there is love. And that's absolutely the green flag. And if they're not curious, and if it's kind of parallel play, where they're just getting on with their life and you're some sideshow, I think that's a warning sign. And it's probably something about relationships generally for them, that relationships have never been prioritized in that way. I'm going to come on to in a minute. Some people, their primary thing has always been kind of winning, fighting and winning in life. So moving on to that, actually, the people who are dominated by competition, dominated by winning. I've talked about this part in other videos. We have the drive and reward part, more stuff, more status, more money. And there's quite a lot of people, I think, who go between their survival part, so the kind of fear and anger part, and they get their sense of worth and value, just temporary highs from winning. And like I said, that is through work, promotions, bonuses, material status. As I've said repeatedly, it's a helpful thing in life. It's very attractive in other people, I think, to have this kind of drive part, moving them through life. It motivates them. We get the benefits of it if we're in relationship, and vice versa if that's what they're doing. The thing to recognize about it, though, I think, is that the qualities that enable somebody to win and mean that they win are things like, I've always got to be the best. I will like empathy, probably for the person who I'm beating, because if I was going to really worry about the other person or have lots of empathy for the person who's going to lose, I may not compete against them. So I think it can, when we're in that competitive place, when we're in that place of being preoccupied by winning, that's what's important. I think it's a this place rather than a connected place. My worth and value entirely rides on whether I win or not. And if somebody is able to switch between protect, provide, and then connect, that's perfect, isn't it? But some people really are not doing that. As I say, what they're doing is going between fighting and winning and not particularly occupying that place of connection, which is vital to connected, ongoing, sustainable, loving relationships. Because if you're in a kind of rupture type situation with somebody who's in that competition place a lot, or dominated by competition, certainly if they're dominated by fighting, you've got a problem, because you're always going to need to have to bend the knee. And if they're dominated by needing to win, in a rupture type situation, they're going to need to win. They're probably going to lack empathy. Loss is so distressing for them. They're not going to be able to concede or compromise or say sorry, because those things feel like losing. So I think that's something to really be conscious of. As I said, I can understand it's a very attractive quality in human beings where there is this drive, material status, wealth. There seems to be some sort of pre-programmed thing for people to be attracted to it. And I think, as I say, if somebody's able to go between the two and know what skills and qualities are necessary here, and then be able to switch gears, and in relationship or in a conflict situation, or be able to switch to those qualities like empathy, patience, connection, compromise, that are much more the place of relationship and good relationships, then that's wonderful. But I would, if you're looking at red flags, about warning signs, I would notice whether that is what somebody's able to do. The other thing about somebody being dominated by competition, and some people will say this, they'll laugh and say that they compete with their partner, their romantic partner. If, again, you're able to go between the two and be loving, then great. But there are some people who are dominated by it. So their partner's success, career progression, financially, actually, they want to get ahead of them. It exists even within romantic relationships, which might seem slightly strange. And some people say that that's an important part of their relationship. But the difficulty with it is, if we're competing with each other in their romantic relationship, I might start to see that my success, job promotion, financial, whatever it is, you don't feel good when that happens, because suddenly you're not winning anymore. And if that's the situation, somebody might start to, hide their successes or not go for their successes because they don't want to make their partner feel bad. So I think that can be an indicator of potential problems as well. As with all of these, we want the competition and drive part of us to be within our control, to be under our management. We don't want to be entirely under its management if we're looking at good connected relationships. And just finishing off on this dominance of the kind of competition and winning and status and drive and being under management, that part, a lot of people don't know what's enough, and it's never enough. And what if you get into a relationship with somebody where it's never enough, materially, career-wise, whatever it might be, you as a relationship will always be a sideshow to that. Somebody needs to know what's enough, and you can ask them that, what's enough financially, what's enough career-wise, because acquiring status, money, if we're in that, we're not in connected relationships. They're two mutually exclusive states. So, if you want to have a good ongoing connected relationship with somebody, that answer to that question, what's enough, is an important one, I think. And then just finishing off on this, the last point is, I've talked about kind of red flags in the other person, red flags in ourselves, to notice what's happening internally for us that suggests that there's something about this relationship, there's a problem. One of those things is going to be that we behave in this relationship or feel in this relationship in a way that we don't seem to experience other relationships as well. Of course, we all have to take responsibility for our own responses and what we do in relationship and how we're responding to this person. But what can happen if we are, for example, in relationship with somebody who's very narcissistic, is that it's very triggering, it's exasperating if somebody never takes responsibility, if we always take the blame or have to take the blame, or find that things are never actually repaired, they're just swept under the carpet. We will feel unsafe, we'll be irritated, annoyed, and it will be a very different us than it is in other relationships, say work relationships or friendships or other family relationships. So that's really important to notice. Am I behaving very differently here? Is it a very different part of me that's showing here than is generally in life? We're always going to be different in a romantic relationship than we are in a professional relationship, friendship, family relationship. But I think you know what I mean. If this is always fighting, if this, people would describe it as some sort of, toxic environment potentially, then that's something very important to notice. Also, isolation. So starting not to tell other people about things that are happening within the relationship. If you're looking at a relationship, is a key thing here. We start to get ashamed possibly of what we're tolerating, and I will come on to that in the next video. So if I'm starting to isolate as well, if somebody's very narcissistic, they might want me to isolate from other people. We can get quite disorientated. We start to think, perhaps, am I the drama? And those sorts of things can separate us from others. If we tell friends about this person and what's happening, they might start to say, what are you doing? Why are you staying? So what some people can do is stop talking about it. So that thing about isolating, friendships coming apart, potentially seeing less of other people, more time being spent trying to manage the relationship, trying to get through to the person or whatever it is, I think can be a real sign that there is a red flags generally. That's a warning sign generally about the relationship. Okay, so those are some suggested ideas for red flags. As I said at the beginning, I'd love to hear what you think. Let me know what you think of some of the things I've talked about. Also add your own either below in comments or write to me separately. If there's anything else you want me to talk about some more, then please do. The next video I'm going to be talking about why we don't see them when we come into a relationship. Some of these in terms of boundaries, communication, our reality not being as important as another person, they seem so significant. You would think, why would we not notice that? Or also why, when we do notice it, will we carry on? And I think that's a very key part of all this. So I'll be explaining all that in the next video. And then in the third one, what we can do about it if we've been doing this and see that we've been doing this repeatedly and we no longer want to. Because, these are red flags. They're warning signs of something. It doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, we have to get out immediately. All relationships are a long game. And I'm going to talk about that more within video 3. Or you might decide to get out. I'll be talking about that too. But just to finish off here, if any of those things above that I've talked about as far as red flags are combined with self-reflection, with curiosity, with active, proactive working on them being different, then it may be an environment within which you choose to remain and continue working as long as you see change happening. But as I say, I'm going to come on to it in the third video. There are people who are just better left untrusted, I think, in that way, who are never going to do it. They pay lip service to it, but they will never work on these red flags. Anyway, I'm going to talk about that some more in the next videos. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful. You take care, and I'll see you again soon.